you looked at last week, since we were asynchronous all week. So we'll take a few minutes just to kind of reflect on the content for Tuesday of last week was looking at abuse and violence in relationships, right? There are a few kind of key points that I want to make sure everyone understands and, has been exposed to. And just as a reminder, if you're able to turn your cameras on, I think right now I just see one other lovely face amongst all the black squares. There's some people. Thank you all. Appreciate it. Just makes it feel a little less, I don't know, awkward or disengaged, something. All right. So anyways, looking at violence and abuse in relationships, I'm going to just kind of touch on, so the text went through a variety of factors that might contribute to violence and abuse in relationships, right? So there are some cultural factors, some specific individual factors that could contribute to finding oneself in an abusive relationship. There were also some familial factors, so patterns in the family that might, lead to this dynamic. But I want us to talk briefly about your understanding of this model. So this was brought out in the textbook in terms of the cycle of abuse that people find themselves sort of caught in, right, in abusive relationships. And then you also had a supplemental article to read related to this content. So can anyone just kind of in layman's terms either unmute or share in the chat what your understanding of this cycle is? Sorry, I paused to read about weird static. Are you guys still hearing static in my background? No?
Not really.
Okay. Anyone willing to share how they understand this cycle to function? Someone said it's hard to break. Someone else?
My understanding, I'm sorry, I don't know who I cut off, was that a lot of it, like the first one, most of it, I think like 70% of it is more than likely like silence. Like you're building tensions, your partner is getting upset with you, but they're not telling you why. And they're letting it all build out because they don't want to handle the conflict. Then there's like a huge argument, right? And then in the cycle of abuse, maybe it's emotional, blaming, physical abuse. And then after they let out all their anger, then they're reconciling with you and saying, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, I'll be better. And then everything's fine and calm and the same until it happens again. And then in that relationship, like the cycles, it tends to get shorter and shorter between each incident until both parties can't take it anymore or something bad happens.
Right. Yes. And so just to give you kind of the psychological experience of what's happening here is that as Desi was describing that period of tension building, right? That's kind of like a pot put on to simmer, right? And it simmers and simmers and simmers, and then eventually it boils. And that's the incident that we see or we observe. And it's either verbal, emotional, physical abuse, sometimes even just threatening or intimidation. It doesn't have to be overt physical violence to be classified as abuse, right? So it's really important to kind of be clear on what constitutes abuse in a relationship. But what happens in this cycle is that after this incident, there's this period of reconciliation where, and it doesn't necessarily look like peace. It just looks like the abuser either blaming the victim, sometimes gaslighting the victim, right? Minimizing the situation. It wasn't what you thought it was. I didn't say that. That's not what I meant. All of that can be considered the reconciliation period Okay. And then following that is this period of calm. And someone said in the chat that the calm period or these moments of peace are what offer the victim hope that things will get better, right? And the calm period is kind of this honeymoon phase. Sometimes in the calm period, you see grandiose displays of romance or, trying to make up in ways that, certainly don't make up for abusive behaviors. But that's kind of the thinking process from the abuser, right? And psychologically, what's happening here is, so I don't know if you all have a basic understanding of principles of behavior, reinforcement and punishment, right? But reinforcement is something that occurs after a stimulus is presented and it encourages a behavior to continue, right? And it typically happens every time the stimulus is presented, or it doesn't happen at all. But this intermittent reinforcement, or your textbook calls it aperiodic reinforcement, it happens once in a while, right? And that's actually the strongest form of reinforcement because you never know when it's coming. So people who are the victims in abusive relationships, they get caught in this trap, this cycle where they're constantly kind of waiting for that honeymoon phase, for that romance, for those little crumbs of affection, whatever that keeps them coming back for more. And the reason psychologically is because it's being reinforced in such a chaotic way that they don't know what to expect. Because obviously, if we always expected abuse, it would seem much more black and white, cut and dry, that we would just say, this is how this person treats me. I don't need to be in this type of relationship. But when it's back and forth kind of mixed messages, that's what creates this cycle and keeps it happening. And someone else put into the chat that the TV show The Maid on Netflix, I don't know if you guys have seen that. I binge watched that in like maybe 2 nights because it was fascinating and captivating. And I will agree with you, Kennedy, that it really did demonstrate how tricky this type of relationship can be. And I think something that it kind of came out of our conversation yesterday around this message or this topic was that this can kind of sneak up on you, right? So there are oftentimes you find yourself caught in an abusive relationship before you even notice these were the kind of red flags leading up to this, because sometimes it's very subtle, very, sort of what seem like small little things that eventually kind of snowball into a bigger issue situation. I think, Callie, do you have your hand up raised?
Yeah, so I watched Maid too, and one thing that stuck out to me when I watched that was that I think they said at the end, but it takes an average of 9 times for someone who's in an abusive relationship to actually be able to fully leave the relationship. And I just thought that was like a really powerful statistic because it's not just that, like if you're being abused and you feel like it's really hard to get out of it, like it's really not just you. Is that everyone really, really struggles to be able to fully separate from that person because there are reasons that you stay with them at the end of the day,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also there is some shame and guilt and some like cultural societal stuff that is at play there where, none of us probably want to admit that we tolerated bad behavior in that way or that we were, subjecting ourselves to that type of circumstance, especially for an extended kind of ongoing period of time. Desi, do you care to share a little bit more about what you put in the chat about children-parent relationships?
Sure. So what I think is something that's not always talked about, we always hear it in relationships, in parent to child relationships, but I think that it also happens from children to parents. I think that parents sometimes can give their kids everything that they want, all the help that they need, and parents are naturally a little bit more controlling and concerned when they're good parents. And then the young adult, they go out to college, they go out into the world, they get their few specks of freedom, and then they feel like their parents are holding them back, and then they start to lash out at their parents. And that's when you hear a lot about like people being really close with their children. And then towards the end of undergraduate to the beginning of their careers, they start talking less and less. Like, you know, they start coming home less and less, or they start coming only for the holidays, and then, you know, they get married and then you see them less and less and less. So I think that that's also a valid argument.
Yeah, and I do think it's really important to mention that this, and the text spoke to some of these other familial relationships that can experience abuse and or neglect, right? Elder abuse is a really key issue that happens a lot in society, as well as, you know, the kind of family dynamics that Desi was mentioning. And that stuff just doesn't get talked about, and it definitely doesn't get romanticized in the media as much as, you know, partner abuse. And another point to make there, and this kind of goes back to our conversation last time we were together, you know, partner abuse oftentimes is portrayed as men as the abuser and women as the victim. And that's obviously not always the case, right? Women are at times the abuser in the relationship. There isn't as much research out there about what that looks like. Speculated because, you know, men are often not self-reporting as much or talking about the issues as much as maybe women coming out of abusive relationships are. And there's also not a lot of research about how abuse functions and what it looks like in, you know, homosexual, bisexual, other relationships. This cycle of abuse, in fact, was written based on the model of a heterosexual abusive relationship. And I see some things coming into the chat about stigma around that, wishing that there was more awareness of female abusive males. I agree. And then I think there was a recommendation for a book called It Ends With Us. Difficult to read, but really important if you find yourself asking the question, why doesn't someone just leave? Yeah. So, and Madison, this is an interesting point. Like in the media, we see women hit men all the time and it's not deemed abuse, right? Is that what you mean when you say that? Yeah.
Yeah, it's actually like comedic. Sometimes we see a woman hit a man in the face and the reaction is either like he deserved it or that didn't hurt. We think, oh, that didn't hurt him because women aren't as strong generally.
Right.
Or it's comedic, like it's like a laugh line, like she smacks him in the face.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. So there's lots of gender ideology stuff kind of inherent in all of that, right? And then I think it's pretty obvious. You can see how that might play out in real life, in, you know, real relationships, in terms of the dynamics between men and women in relationships. And then yes, psychological abuse. So that's not something that was necessarily brought out in this PowerPoint as much or in the chapter, but I think psychological abuse is harder to recognize, harder to define, certainly as compared to, you know, physical abuse. That's pretty cut and dry, you know. But yeah, psychological abuse, I think, happens in a lot of relationships, and it's definitely not talked about as much, and probably not as well understood, and can happen, you know, across genders, and can last for a lot longer before it's noticed. Absolutely. All right. Any final thoughts or ideas on this? So I want you to be able to explain the cycle of abuse, kind of think through what might contribute to abuse in a relationship, you know, someone existing in that type of relationship for any length of time. Madison, you have a question or comment?
What is aperiodic reinforcement? I don't remember reading that in the chat.
Yeah, it's also called intermittent reinforcement. And I was just talking about that a few minutes ago, when it's that sort of chaotic response rather than I always know what to expect. You know, it's when, so like oftentimes abusive partners are also very doting, you know, on their partner. It's just unpredictable. And so that element of unpredictability is what keeps people kind of hanging on, waiting for that doting, loving partner to show back up. And that psychologically, you know, when you look at like Pavlov's dogs, stimulus, the bell equals dog food. If you do that every time, the dog immediately learns bell equals food, bell equals food. In the same way that, you know, people learn so-and-so equals, you know, love and respect or whatever. But when you mix that up where bell sometimes doesn't equal food, and then sometimes bell equals food, the dog actually attends to the stimulus that much more because they're waiting for that off chance that it equals food. And that's kind of, I mean, I hate to use the analogy of dogs, but those principles of psychology and behavior, they do apply to all organisms, including humans, you know. Desi?
I was just also going to say it's worth noting with female women in the cycle of abuse that I feel like they tend to get to marriage a lot easier, even under that cycle of abuse, than I feel that when it's between men and women. And I think that because sometimes it is more psychological, there's a lot more manipulation that's at play that can drive them towards a more secured relationship. Whereas with men, I feel like more often, if there's going to be a cycle of abuse, it's going to lean on the physicality of it. If you know what I mean, I feel like that's worth noting.
Yeah, I agree. And so, you know, really the take home message is that this is very complex stuff, right? It doesn't always show up in the way that we would expect it to. And it's not always, you know, so easy. Sometimes from the outside looking in, it feels like it should be easy to say, you know, clearly you're being emotionally abused in this relationship, whatever. But when you're in it, it's very complex because there are a lot of nuances, and that psychological abuse piece, you know, is just really difficult to recognize and kind of work around, for sure. Final thoughts on this before we kind of shift gears? All right, thank you all for a good conversation around that. So the second part of last week then was focused on parenting, not necessarily the act of parenting, but the transition and decision-making surrounding becoming parents, right? So we looked at issues related to you know, having children, how many children to have, what sort of time frame of life to have children. If you're not able to have children, things like adoption, you know, fostering, those type of choices. And then you had a supplemental video to watch on the infertility rates dropping, and it's a global trend that we're seeing, right? Would anybody be willing to share, maybe someone that hasn't given us anything yet, what was your sort of takeaway from that video? You wrote your discussion post around. You can use the chat or you can unmute.
My takeaway was that just we need to make it possible for women and men to be parents and to have good careers, because ultimately, like, especially women are transitioning to now seeking higher education. I mean, we've talked about this a lot. And then in very time-consuming careers. But ultimately, if we want to keep being humans, then families are important.
Sure.
But a lot of people have to choose between them, and they can't do both. And so with the choice, when you spend, you know, thousands and thousands of dollars on a degree to get a career and you have years, you're probably going to choose a career because, like, from the individual standpoint, it doesn't really impact population. But if every single person has that mindset, eventually it will. So that was my takeaway, that just changes to institutions so that it's possible for people to be parents and have good careers as well.
Yes. And so what that might look like is family-friendly workplace policies, things like paternity leave, extended maternity leave. In the United States, a mother after having given birth is granted 6 weeks of time before she's expected to return to work full time. And I can tell you from my own children being born, those first 4 weeks, I mean, they're basically like an extension of prenatal development outside the womb, right? Children are, and maybe even the first 6 weeks, infants, they sleep the majority of the time, they're not engaging with you. Your body is going through a tremendous amount of healing and regeneration. And then you're expected to just put all of that aside and hit the ground running and get right back to business as usual. And that, it's not a best practice. And there are countries globally that do it much better than we do it in the United States. But that's definitely an argument, there could be an argument made for better workplace policies around birth and the return to work for mothers and fathers. And then childcare in the United States is a huge issue in and of itself. It's at a crisis level of concern right now. There's a major lack of childcare. There's a lack of high quality childcare. The cost of moderate to low quality childcare is often more than what families can actually financially, bear. And so looking at not just that, first year of life, but how do we as societies, help families take care of their children while working? Because, Kelsey pointed out, some families don't have choice, right? Because of our economic system now, most families need a dual income. But even for those families that don't, women should have the right to choose a career path and to work outside the home if that's what they want. And we still need to support the family because, as it was simply put, if we as humans want to continue to exist, then families in some contexts, do have to be part of that. I was trying to read some of these things in the chat. Yeah, someone works as a nanny, said they're being constantly contacted to see if they can care for children. It is a hard balance for mothers. For women to continue their career, it is difficult. Yep, those childcare issues. When you're working with them personally, it's a whole other thing. And most families, I mean, you're paying like almost college tuition rates by the time you get a child from 0 to 5 or 6 in childcare. It is a lot of money every year, a lot of money. And then, in Europe, that's part of the deal, right? It's government funded, universal childcare. And so again, there are places that are setting a model and doing it better than we are, I would argue. Any other thoughts on this that anybody wants to share?
Marriage is also less common. Like, I feel like, 25 years ago,
Yeah.
You were in high school, when you met the person you wanted to get married to, you got married really young, you had a kid, and then you were kind of stuck with them, because even no matter if they were a good or a bad partner, just because of the social construct surrounding marriage and children and family. Today, we live in a different world. Plan B is a lot more effective. We have Planned Parenthood, we have birth control, we have things that allow us to have choices. So if there is a mistake made with a relationship, you can leave them and still go pursue your goals and stuff. And there's a lot less of a social stigmatism around it. But I think that's also at play because now, we as women can choose to say, this person's not the person I want to have a child with. I can make that decision and move on. It's not always the best choice. It's not always the easiest choice, but it's a choice that we can make freely. And I think that's also worth noting.
Yeah, absolutely. And that delay of marriage. So marriage is certainly not as common as it was, decades ago, but it's also, when it's happening much later in life. And sometimes, women are into their mid to late 30s before they're getting married, and then they're choosing not to have children, either because of, the timeline or just different life, they're pursuing different things in life. But yeah, I think a lot of the things that we've talked about in terms of kind of themes and shifts, trends in relationships are certainly at play in this issue. But something that I wanted you to be aware of, because it definitely ties in with the chapter from last week, and it is interesting, current event type of stuff, right? So gonna shift gears one more time, and today we're going to be talking specifically about choices in parenting. Okay, so this is after you have become a parent. We're going to look at parenting from this kind of choices perspective that our textbook has had us using throughout the course of the semester. I'm going to talk about, some of the nature of parenting choices, what choices people are faced with in the work of parenting. We'll look a little bit at the transition to parenthood for both mothers and fathers, and kind of talk about changes to the family overall. And then I do want to spend a few minutes of time talking about child rearing theories and effective parenting. So different parenting styles and what those kind of look and feel like. And then, what does it mean to be an effective parent? So basically the biggest idea, I guess, around parenting is that parenting is comprised of constant choice and decision. So even the choice not to act on something a child says or does, not to do something, relating to a child's behavior, that is a choice in and of itself, right? Because parents are making a decision in that moment to either implement a consequence for a child or to ignore a behavior, but both of those teach something to the child, right? So everything that parents do is a decision. And a lot of the decisions that parents make involve trade-offs. We were just talking about childcare issues. So there's a financial trade-off inherent in that decision-making process. Yes. If I decide that I want to work outside the home and have an income that supports my family and pursue my career goals, I go into that as a mother knowing that I'm going to have to A, pay for childcare. I'm going to have to B, relinquish time with my children as a trade-off for my own career goals. All of those things involve pros and cons and kind of a, give and take. In terms of resources, time, energy, all that stuff. A lot of parenting, and I would say life in general, is this work of kind of reframing, right? So reframing is a cognitive exercise by which we try to find the good, see the silver lining, take it for what it is. Take what you can use, leave the rest behind, whatever the kind of cliche that you want to use is. But it does not serve a parent to focus on regretful choices or to, spend a lot of time thinking about the negative. Instead, and that's true of anything in life, right? Instead, the charge is to kind of find what you can take and learn from and then move forward in a positive way. Parenting choices are heavily influenced by culture and society. As a parent during COVID world, I can tell you that on a level that I wouldn't have really understood before the pandemic, things that happen at the macro level, at the global, national level, they really do have a trickle-down effect. Sometimes it's very subtle and slow, and then sometimes you wake up one day and you are literally smacked in the face with everything, childcare, schools, everything's closed. How do I function in this new world as a parent? And how is all of this going to impact how I interact with my children, where I let my children go, who I let them be around, all of those things. And then Black Lives Matter movement or resurgence and all of that stuff has societal and cultural implications that show up in our homes and in our families and in our parenting. And those are just some recent examples. I mean, there's a million other examples, but I also want to point out that ACEs, so ACEs is the acronym for Adverse Childhood Events or Experiences. These can include things like physical, sexual, emotional abuse, neglect, exposure to violence in the home, exposure to alcohol and drugs at a young age. Parents can be protective factors for children against ACEs, but they can also be sort of the parents can also, be part of the adverse childhood experience, right? So it's really important to understand what constitutes an adverse childhood experience, and then how, as a parent, do you protect your children from those? Another concept that was brought out in the text, and I think this is just another one of those kind of good nuggets for life, is, and this is coming from a psychoanalyst that did his work in like the 1950s, Donald Winnicott. He said that basically striving for perfection in parenting is not attainable, and it's really not even desirable, because that can sort of take you outside of yourself in terms of your functioning as a parent when you're obsessing over, getting it perfect, right? So he called that idea the good enough parent. And the bottom line is that, a good enough parent, good enough is good enough. You provide love, security, consistency, and structure for children, but, maintain your own identity and don't become obsessed with that role of trying to be the perfect parent. Because let me tell you, it doesn't come with a handbook. I'm about to finish a doctoral degree in family and child studies, and sometimes I look at my 7-year-old and I'm like, what in the world are we doing right now? I have a lot of intellectual knowledge about children and families, and sometimes I have no idea what I'm doing. The 4 basic C's of parenting are also important to kind of note and understand, because these exist across cultures and across societies. And these are the 4 things that promote positive development in children and adolescents. Okay, so those are care in both emotional and physical capacities, consistency. It's that idea that children need predictability. They need to know what to expect in terms of routine, responses of parents. That consistency is really important. Choices, in the same way that children need consistency, they also need some control over their own lives. And so they need to be given a safe space to make choices and to also make mistakes. I would throw that in. And then consequences. Children have to understand in some way, shape, or form that our choices have effects on other people, and also, we bear the consequences of what we choose in life. And so sometimes it's an exercise in giving your child a choice, letting them make the wrong one, and then implementing a consequence that does not feel good to you or your child, as a way for them to learn, this is what happens when you make the wrong choice. The text also talks about these kind of 7 basic parenting choices. We've already touched on number 1 and number 2, kind of last week was a precursor to that, right? So it's whether or not you're even going to have children, and if so, how many children will a family choose to have? Something kind of related to that is the idea of the intervals that occur between children. So how many years, will you wait between siblings? And then the 4th one, method of discipline. This is going to relate some to what we talked about, or what we're going to talk about with parenting styles. But parents will either, overtly decide on a method of discipline, or a method of discipline or guidance will kind of emerge naturally in the family relationship. But I think it's probably best, if, especially in a co-parenting situation, or even as a single parent, to chart that course and kind of know what your plan is, so that you can execute that plan rather than just kind of letting it happen. And then number 6 and 7, or I'm sorry, number 5 and 6 are kind of interrelated, especially in a co-parenting relationship. There has to be some decision making, and oftentimes this happens overtly, through clear communication. Sometimes it just kind of emerges again, but this degree to which each parent will invest time with their children, and then how parents are going to allocate that time and energy. So sometimes in a relationship, you'll see one parent, function as more of the disciplinarian, and the other parent is kind of the fun parent. Some parents, stay home with their children and they are the primary caregiver, while the other parent is out, working or doing something outside the home. All of those are choices around parenting that families must make. And then choices around technology. I have a quick video clip that I want you to watch with me, because I think that these parents can speak to it, at least probably in a more impactful way than I will. But this is that thread that we've seen, woven throughout the course all semester, is that technology is a big, I don't want to call it an issue, but it's definitely something that we have to be aware of. And it shows up in our home lives, in our partner relationships, and also in our relationships with children. So this is like 3 minutes, but I think there's some good issues brought out in this if you'll just watch and think about the things that you see and hear in this video. And then we'll talk about it in a second, if I can get it to work.
In our home,
That's loud. Okay.
Have 3 TVs, 2 laptops, 4 iPads, and 2 cell phones.
2 smartphones, 1 iPad, 1 Samsung tablet, 1 smart TV, 1 Google Home, 2 old school TVs.
In our home, we have a television, an iPad, and 2 smartphones.
My kids probably spend 3 hours at least a day.
Maybe 4 to 6 hours a day.
1 to 2 hours.
40 minutes to 1 hour.
She likes to watch things on YouTube.
She really loves Minions, and she really loves Moana.
They play a lot of games.
Sometimes he goes on Netflix.
Even Elijah, he knows the iPad and knows how to swipe.
I think devices and media have definitely changed parenting. It's enabled us to be able to do things like my husband and I sleeping in.
I'm a single parent, and the phone has become a way for me to occupy her when I'm trying to cook, when I'm commuting, when I need to take a shower.
If he follows the rules, then he gets iPad time.
There are times when the boys acts up, and just recently we took their iPads away for a month.
I do have concerns that, with things like SpongeBob, there's definitely violence.
Even commercials nowadays, like my eldest used to ask, why are they dressed that way?
He was just like going to YouTube, but the stuff that he was being suggested to watch were completely inappropriate for his age.
I absolutely think that there is educational value to digital media. One of the shows actually that my kids have been really into is Wild Kratts. And my daughter knows more than I have ever known about animals from watching that show.
When he was little, we used the bilingual apps so he could learn Spanish and practice. I recently started using some coding websites.
There are times when they would ask about, what city, where's Egypt? And so I'd use my app to show Google Earth, and then we'd zoom in to show Egypt.
In terms of using TV time as special time with him, we'll do a Friday movie night. I noticed that after the movie's done, he wants to talk about the movie. He wants to kind of relate what he watched.
He really likes having me or my husband play with him, and so we frequently will play together.
We have a competition. Me and Nathan is one team, and my wife and Ezekiel is another.
What is that? I try to read with her every night. She has a couple of favorite books that she's gotten to the point that she's memorized them, so she can sort of read them to me.
as my kids get older, I really hope that they will learn how to use media responsibly.
That he uses media to learn new things.
And my hope is that they know the value of the outside world, that you need to go out.
Most of all, I hope that she's happy.
All right. What were some of the things you saw and heard those parents talking about?
I thought it was funny that one of them said that they wouldn't let their child watch SpongeBob, or they didn't want them to because they thought it was violent, which is something that like a lot of my parents would watch SpongeBob with me, but I know a lot of other people that I went to school with whose parents would not let them watch SpongeBob, and they weren't allowed to watch it when they came over to our house. So it's funny that like parents are still like enforcing that.
And so that's an issue of censorship, right? Around what children are exposed to on television. There was another mother in the video that talked about YouTube and kind of the recommended videos that pop up for a child being really inappropriate for that child's age. And so like, once you make the decision to allow screen time and what that's going to look like in terms of time and whatnot, then there are other decisions that have to be made, as kind of a follow-up to that decision itself. What else?
It seems like that they're using technology as like a babysitter. I know like that for a fact. Like I was thinking about it. Like I'm watching my sister right now, and she's at my apartment and I'm at school, and I know that she's definitely been on her iPad since I left.
My
Because
children are on the couch on their tablets at the moment.
yeah, like it is a babysitter, and I know she's not always like she's 11. I know she's not always watching like the best influential things. Like she's on TikTok, and she's had like body image issues because of it.
Yeah.
But it's like, what do I do? Do I tell her like you can't be on the iPad? Because then she's like, well, what do I do while you're gone for 3 hours?
Yeah. And so one of the issues that Madison raised is, and we saw a single mom talking about it, like there as a function, like from a functionality standpoint. And right now I'm home alone, and I'm trying to facilitate an online class. What I could make it harder on myself, I suppose, and try to keep them, but I'm guaranteed an hour and 15 minutes of time if I set them up with something like that. And everyone knows that, and so that's what, now they're probably doing some kind of like pixel art coloring, or they're on Amazon Fire tablets that are very censored and kind of built in to be kid friendly. But that is the way of the world. And if you're a single mom and you need to cook and take shower, all those things that she was saying, or the mom who said it allows my husband and I to sleep in on the weekends, when you're getting up and doing the daily grind 5 days a week, you want to probably capitalize on that opportunity to get an extra hour of sleep on a Saturday morning. And technology can certainly play that role. But also Madison brought out that, especially girls in that tween to adolescent period of life, there's so much that is skewed and presented in the media in a way that's not necessarily an accurate portrayal of like the female form, or just real life in general. I mean, the highlight reel that you see on Instagram and TikTok and Facebook, like none of that's actually real. But you don't know that when you're 11, or maybe even when you're 21, or 35. I don't know, it's there's a lot of societal and psychological issues kind of inherent in all of this, for sure. Desi?
I also think that it brings forth the issue of economic instability. Like, these parents might not want their kids to watch SpongeBob, might not want their kids to have to do this while they do that, but can they afford to pay someone to take them to other experiences and, immersions, to take them to the park? Can they themselves afford to take time off to go, give them their kids all these experiences? Because the benefit of technology, thankfully today, is that it's so widespread around the world that there is a lot of immersion that's possible, but at the same time you're risking the fact that they're going to be exposed to some things that you don't necessarily know if you want them to be exposed to.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think there's definitely some access equity issues surrounding all of this, for sure. And I was going to say something else. but it went out of my head. Sorry. Oh yeah, so and this kind of came out at the back end of the video, right? I do want to be clear that there's a ton of research out there around technology and the role that it plays with young children, and it's not all bad. You know, we saw parents saying their children were bilingual, doing coding, doing you know, research around geography, and there are a lot of positives that can come from using technology. And I certainly think we live in a time where you're doing your children a great disservice if they don't have some basic understanding of how to use technology and how to use it in safe and appropriate ways, right? So it's kind of like what Madison said, you know, you're towing that line, and I'm doing that with my own children at a younger age. It's like they need to know how to sit down in front of a computer and do some research, and they need to know how to like function in the world of touchscreen technology, you know. But I don't know that I want my 1-year-old spending 4 to 6 hours on an iPad just from a like brain development standpoint. Personally, that, you know, that was my choice as a parent. But at the end of the day, that's what I wanted you to see, is that parents raising children in our society, and yeah, that balance between exposure and then sheltering, that's kind of the line we walk as parents with all the issues, right? Is like, how much do we teach them so that they can be safe and fully functioning in the world, but also, you know, aware of the issues. But yeah, lots of really important choices that have significant implications for children related to use of technology. I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint now and talk about the transition to parenthood. So the transition to parenthood for mothers, it has its own term, sort of like we have the term adolescence for that transition from childhood to adulthood. The term is called matrescence. And basically this period of becoming, you know, going from woman to mother, if you will, is sort of looked at as in the same way that the period of adolescence is looked at, right? So it's this major upheaval in terms of mind, body, hormonal changes that mark this process of transition into a new phase of life or development. And then related to this idea of maternal wellness, if you remember back to the very beginning of the semester when we talked about theoretical frameworks, we talked about the sociobiological theory, which suggests in this case that mother and infant attachment has a biological basis and is based on survival. So infants attach to the mother in order to stay alive, and mothers, you know, are evolutionarily, we're solely responsible for, you know, gestation, birth, lactation after birth. And each of these phases of infant development results in hormonal changes for the mother that connect the mother and bond the mother to the infant. So mothers and infants are usually both very resistant to separation from one another. And that's why the conversation that we began this piece with, in terms of, you know, fertility dropping and all of those issues with family planning that we talked about, maternity leave and, you know, the need for extended time away from work to do this business of mothering, at least initially, is very important and is kind of a critical issue in our society. Other issues related to maternal wellness include postpartum depression, lack of social and familial support, again, related to recent trends and shifts in our society that we are, you know, most of the time people are moving away from their nuclear family, and we are much more transient than we once were. So sometimes people find themselves parenting with a real lack of support. That's probably why college students in this area are getting called all the time to see if they can, you know, fill that stopgap, right? Because there's no family support, where in another lifetime, you know, you would have just left them with your aunt or your grandma who lived on the same property as you. And so that's a challenge to maternal wellness and to kind of parenting in general. And And then related to fatherhood, so this brings up some issues that we've talked about all along, you know, gender ideology issues. What is the man's role in the home, in the family? Many men today find themselves kind of caught between old and newer ideas related to masculinity and fatherhood. Today, we are seeing an increase in paternal involvement. This begins with fathers giving support to mothers during the birthing process. This is a recent trend, right? It used to be a woman's world outside of, you know, the physician in the room, and now men are typically in the room as birth partners, and that kind of sets a precedent for how things will go in terms of co-parenting, rather than that more traditional mom as the caregiver, dad as, you know, the provider or whatever. But a lot of men, you know, are sort of maybe struggle with those ideology issues. And then male postpartum depression, it's another one of those issues. It's not widely acknowledged, it's not widely talked about, but it does happen. And it's related to, again, this major upheaval in terms of, you know, who you were before you became a parent and this new dynamic. That also comes into play when we think about the shift from a couple as a dyad of two people functioning now as a triad or more, with more people in the family dynamic. And it, you know, it's just, again, changes to the dynamics of the relationship that have to be navigated and could be challenging. I think the parental roles are pretty straightforward. I will just speak quickly on ritual bearer. So this is the idea that parents serve as the person in the home who they're primarily responsible for creating rituals, things that bond the family unit together, or, you know, create memories and a sense of belonging, right? So that might look like prayers before meal times, Friday night movie nights, game nights, holiday traditions. All of those types of things are related to this idea of parents as ritual bearers. Does anyone have any thoughts or questions on that, or any of the other ones that you see on the list? Okay, I don't want us to run out of time before we talk about, so I don't have a slide on here with parenting styles, but that's okay, I'm going to give them to you. So different parenting styles, right? Overparenting is the idea of helicopter parents, hovering parents that maybe don't allow their child choice or don't allow their child consequence, right? They sort of shelter their child from the experiences of life, and that usually does not serve. It's important to note that while parents are probably the most important influence on a child's development, they are certainly not the singular influence on children's development. So other family members, society at large, other institutions like school, you know, lots of different things play a part in a child's overall development. And each child is unique, right? So the same parenting techniques in the same home might not work on two different children, or might not be as effective, or might result in different outcomes. And so then on these different parenting styles, I want you to understand that there are 4 key parenting styles, and they're based on 2 dimensions, the dimensions of responsiveness and demandingness, okay? So I'm going to give you the 4 parenting styles, and then we'll kind of talk about how they fall on that continuum, or in those dimensions of response and demand. The parenting styles are authoritarian, permissive, authoritative, and uninvolved. So authoritarian parents are going to be the high demand parents who might be highly responsive or moderately responsive. They are responsive to children, but the key thing here is that they are very demanding parents. So authoritarian parents are your my way or the highway. You do it because I said so. Stop crying, I'm going to give you something to cry about. That's an authoritarian parent. A permissive parent is basically the opposite of that. They are highly responsive, but they are very low demand parents, right? So they're very laissez-faire, kind of anything goes, do what you feel. I'll be here to support you, but I'm not going to ask a whole lot of you. That's a permissive parent. Parents who have the best outcomes for children, the parenting style that is related to the most positive development for children, is an authoritative parent. And they tend to be balanced in terms of their demandingness and their responsiveness. So they are responsive to children's needs, but they also set high appropriate expectations for children. But instead, and authoritarian and authoritative parents might ask the same things of a child, but they kind of come at it from a different way, where the authoritarian parent says, do it because I said so. The authoritative parent is more inclined to say, do this because you want to be a community member that shows respect to others. They give like rationale and reason, and they're trying to help their children kind of think through life more than the parent who just says it's my way. And then the fourth style, uninvolved, is exactly what it sounds like. These are parents who are neither responsive or demanding because they are really hands-off in terms of how they parent their children. There's a table in your book on page 266 that has a breakdown of a variety of developmental theories that explain child development, child learning, a lot of issues related to how children work and operate, and then kind of out of that, some ideas related to parenting. Thoughts on parenting styles, or any questions if anything was unclear? Okay. I included this graphic. We're kind of shifting gears now to talk about effective parenting and what that looks like. So I think it's important to note that one-on-one time with children, connection with children, encouragement or praise of specific actions instead of, use of rewards or bribes, focus on what you can control rather than, just focusing on the stress. This is kind of an example of that cognitive reframing piece of parenting that I talked about. Providing consistent age-appropriate consequences and guidelines, positive interactions to correct problematic behavior, yelling, timeout, nagging, corporal punishment. Those things generally don't work to correct behavior long-term, and they certainly don't instill what we want to convey to our children, probably to our children. And then working towards a balance of meeting parent and child needs. A lot of what we think about in terms of family dynamics is related to this idea of balance, and that can be difficult to achieve. I think it's important to provide some type of discipline, encourage responsibility, that piece about media and monitoring that, especially as you enter into the teenage years. We talked about sex education in terms of what is its place in the public school. I agree that it has a place there, but I certainly think that it also has a place in the home, and that parents have a responsibility, to provide sex education to their children, to teach emotional competence and empathy for others. All of those are ways to be an effective parent. And then I'm gonna stop there, and I'll just refer you to, in terms of thinking about being creative in how we parent teenagers. I posted a video resource to the course page. It's called Parenting Teens video. It's like 5 minutes of a TEDx talk from, I think, a 15-year-old who was talking about what teens want from their parents. She goes into some ideas. She has some like colloquial terms for different parenting styles that she uses, but she talks about those authoritarian and permissive parents. And then she gives a new term to the authoritative parent, but that's what she says, you know, that's what teens are looking for. She calls them the listener parent. I can't remember the terms that she uses for the others, but it's an interesting watch. It will only take 5 minutes of your life if you want to allocate that there. But there's nothing else for you to do for today or for this week. If you will type your names into the chat so that I have record of you being on the call. And then, yeah, for the Thursday content, there's a PowerPoint posted that just guides you through chapter 13, I believe we're on. And then a video. It's a really interesting video about, again, that idea of balance and striving for balance between work and family. And the person in the video argues that that's not maybe even possible in our society nowadays. So yeah, read chapter 13 in your text, review that content, but there's no discussion or anything for the rest of this week. And we are coming up on the end. I think we have 2 more classes after this, and somehow we've made it through another semester. Thank you all for your time. Enjoy the rain. It's beautiful outside. See you next week.